Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Kilayim, Perek Zayin Halacha Vav, God willing, concluding this chapter, and starting Perek Ches Halacha Aleph. We're going to be learning today Daf Samach Zayin. We left off on Daf Samach Vav Amid Beis, 4 lines before the bottom of the Amid, in the beginning of the line. Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi Boi, we are in middle of asking inquiries. We are focusing on the differentiation that we learned in the Mishnah between the Atzitz Nakuf versus the Atzitz She'ena Nakuf. And we're going to focus specifically now, the way we're learning the Gemara, on the unperforated pot, which, as we learned in the Mishnah, is considered detached. However, even though it's considered detached, the Mishnah says it's not Mekadesh, which implies that Lechatchila, and like we can use Midrabanan, we do consider them attached to the ground. Based on that premise, we're going to have this third and final inquiry. We will also clarify, I kept on mentioning yesterday, that when you have a hole in the pot, when you have the perforated pot, not only is it that when it's on the ground, when the pot is on the ground, is it considered, according to the Chachamim, mamish, attached? It doesn't have to be on the ground. It has to be within 10 tfachim. Not 3 tfachim, I just looked at it. It's 10 tfachim from the ground. That is when, according to those opinions who hold that it's attached, it's going to be considered attached. And finally, we're going to have a big chiddush, that even though the Mishnah ruled that grain in a perforated flower pot, is considered attached, and it becomes even asur bahana, that's only if it was in a kedem, if it passed through a vineyard. Interestingly, if it's only near the single vine, now when it comes to planting a grain near the avoida of a single vine, which is 6 tfachim, it's going to be asur and mekadesh, as we just learned. But when it comes to a perforated pot, even though it's considered attached, not mamish attached, and again, we're going to see that when it comes to the single vine, it will not be considered attached on a biblical level. That will be more or less the conclusion of the 7th chapter. Now, B'chlal, we only have 2 more chapters left, the 8th and the 9th. It's correct to say that the 8th chapter is going to be about kilei behema. Kilayim of animals include 2 categories. Number 1, we're not allowed to mate animals of diverse species. And number 2, we're not allowed to work with a mixed team. Working with a mixed team would mean, like the Torah says, don't harness to your plow a shor v'chamoir. And it's not only the shor v'chamoir, but that will be the general topic of the chapter. But the Perek does not begin directly with kilei behema. The Perek begins by contrasting all the different types of kilayim. To a certain degree, we'll have a certain synopsis in the beginning of the 8th chapter. Stam to know, the 9th chapter will be about kilei bigodim, will be about shatnez, even though we will also have a mention of it in the 1st chapter today, in the beginning of the 8th chapter. And finally, even though we mentioned so many times up until now that the prohibition of kilei hakedem isn't only not to plant, but it's also biblically not to maintain. We'll have that means that if something happened by itself, then I have to uproot it. And if I don't uproot it, that in itself is a violation. If it grows to 200s, then it becomes asur bahana. But there's an isur to maintain it right away. That isur is midoiraisa, but there is a machlokes whether you'll be chayiv malchus for it or not. We'll see the unique opinion of Rabbi Akiva that even only maintaining kalayim is subject to malchus. Even though you can argue it's a lav she'ein by maisa, we're going to get into that as we conclude today's daf. So, Chevra, we are starting on daf samach vav amid beis. Again, 4 lines before the bottom of the amid, based on the premise, like we mentioned in the introduction, that based on the premise that midrabanan, even the unperforated pot of grain should not be placed in a vineyard. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda about Pazi Boyim, and his inquiry began with a statement in which he has no doubt. So he begins with vadai, and then he goes to a question. What's his vadai? That no tachomesh gefanim b'chamishat sisum she'enum nakuvim. That if you have 5 vines and you planted them in 5 unperforated pots would mean again that since they don't have a hole, biblically they're not considered attached. But rabbinically, lachatchila, we are still concerned with kilei akem. And if you take these 5 unperforated flower pots, Kevin, you mentioned this more or less yesterday, and you make a configuration which is that of a kedem. So based on what we learned, again, that midrabanan, we got a problem. At Omar keremu, this for sure is a kedem. Midrabanan, that's a statement. Keep your finger in the Gemara. Just that's the way the Pnei Moshe learns. Pnei Moshe 5 lines before the bottom of the Amid. At Omar keremu, kloimer vaday mistabrahu the at omer boy the keremu, and therefore, if you made such a configuration of these unperforated pots, you have to, if you want to place grain, you have to distance it 4 amas. But now comes the inquiry of Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi. Once you already established this configuration, and therefore it grabbed the avodah b'drabanan of 4 amas, what happens if now hafachai? What happens if now you made a new arrangement or you changed the arrangement? Now they're no longer configured as a kedem. So do we say that since they were regarded midrabanan as a kedem, so it retains its status? Or do we say, no. Now that you already moved the configuration, you don't even have the shtaim keneged shtaim ha'achas yitzuzanaf, now it's not a problem. And the way the Gemara is going to address his inquiry is not by addressing his inquiry, is by challenging his premise. In other words, like the Pnei Moshe says, when you have them configured, the unperforated pots, shtaim keneged shtaim ha'achas yitzuzanaf, what you're telling me? So he began, no, that's a kedem, midrabanan. The Gemara says it's not true. It's not true. V'yesh kedem mitaltel, even before you changed this arrangement. Even when they are configured, shtaim keneged shtaim ba'achas yotzei. The Gemara is saying against his premise that it will never, not even on a rabbinic level, be considered a kedem. That's already not considered a kedem, because a kedem by definition is real estate. It's something that's unmovable. The fact that you are able to move it, even midrabanan, it's not considered a kedem. That's gavaldik. And now let's go. So the Mishnah stated that Hamavir Otzitz Nakiv, the Chiddush, that if you have a vineyard in the ground, a proper vineyard, and you have a grain that's planted in a perforated pot, and our Tana, not Rab Shimon, we hold that a perforated pot is considered attached to the ground. And here the irony is, if you walk through a kedem, so even though I'm not going to say that you planted it in the kedem, you didn't. The plot was planted outside the kedem, but when you are walking it through the kedem, you are maintaining kalayim. And indeed, so the Mishnah says that if the grain, while you are walking it through the kedem, increased to 200s or more, then the grain becomes us. So says the Gemara Shmuel Amar, that is only the Mavir Tachas called Geffen Begeffen. That's only if the grain was under a vine. When the Gemara says Tachas called Geffen Begeffen, under every single vine, the Mahara Fulda says Lav Davke. It doesn't mean the whole. I'm sorry. It doesn't mean every single one. It means that what can affect the grain in the perforated pot to become mamish kalai midoy raisa, and it becomes asur bahana, becomes kadosh, only when it grew while it was under a vine. But just it being in the environment of the kedem, that will not render it asur bahana. That's Shmuel. Rabbi Yechanan disagrees. Rabbi Yechanan says no, that since la'avir asara hi masnesa, since when you are carrying this perforated pot, the bottom of the pot is within 10 handbreadths of the ground. That's the question I kept on having yesterday. In other words, it's not only if the pot is on the ground do we say that, since it's perforated, even though nothing is going through it, but since there is a hole through which a small shoydish could fit if it would have been there, even though it's not there. It's called attached. So then it's attached not only when it's on the ground, even if it's within 10 tfachim. So since it's within the 10 tfachim, so yes, Rabbi Yochanan argues with Shmuel in such a case, again, only, of course, if it grew an additional 200, then the grain becomes asur b'hano. And finally, as we mentioned in the words of our introduction, our Mishnah was speaking dafke when the perforated pot was being transported through a kerem. Question will be, what will be if the same, but not through a kerem, but under a geffen, a halachic geffen yichidi, whether it's one vine or whatever. It's not a vineyard. So says the Gemara that here's where the Barafulda says lav dafke. It doesn't have to mean 5. We just used 5 just to be symmetrical with what we learned above. So, but here's his case. You have 5. Again, we're learning that the 5 pots here are perforated. That means they are considered attached. And you have them under a vine. Again, 5 is lav dafke. Okay? So then he writes that again, a given, I'm just adding words. The grain will not become usher. The grain will not become usher. That's the key of this ending of the Peder. When do we say that even that it's attached to a kerem? When it comes to a geffen yechidi, the grain will remain permitted. The question is, will the vine become prohibited? That's the question. And we mamish just had this machlekes above between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan. I know, guys, the case of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan was not regarding this case, but it was similar. The case over there, we just had this a few days ago, that a person took his geffen, his vine, he extended it over his fellow's grain. According to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, who hold that ein adam oiser davar she'ena shaloi, the grain is permitted. The grain is permitted. The question is, what about the vine? So we had a machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Yochanan holds that, of course, the vine becomes prohibited. The vine is mine. Remember the chiddush of Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, everyone considers the grain to be the oiser, the cause. So he had this logic that if the cause of the problem itself is not problematic, then nothing else is problematic. And the same thing will be over here. That whoever says that was the argument of Rabbi Elazar, he will hold that in our case, again, we're going with the premise that the grain itself is permitted. Why is it permitted? Because there's no kerem. Well, if the grain is permitted, according to Rabbi Elazar, so will the vine be permitted. According to Rabbi Yochanan, one has nothing to do with the other. The vine will become asad, of course, if the vine grew at 200s. Now, what about in the opposite case? But if you have one flower plot, one otzitz, and it's under 5 grains, in other words, it's not a geffen yechidi, it's a proper vineyard, and therefore the grain becomes usher. That's the case of the Mishnah. Here he has to mention 5. We want to mention 5. Again, not because it's under 5, but because you need to have 5 minimally to have a kedem. That's why he said before 5 atzitzin to be symmetrical with this case. So here, since kol amul moide sheha nesar, since here the grain becomes prohibited as it says in the Mishnah, so therefore everyone will agree that the vine will also become usher. That is the conclusion of the 7th chapter. And on that we say that Hadran Allah Chamavrech Hagefen, that God willing will come back to you. And Be'ezras Hashem, we are starting the 8th chapter. Like we mentioned, the topic of the chapter is Kilei Behema. Topic of the final chapter will be Kilei Begodim. And we begin, now that we already learned about Kilei Zeroim, we learned about Kilei Hakedem. We are beginning to learn about Kilei Behema. And we will also already make mention of Kilei Begodim. We will contrast one with the other. And here we go. Begins the Holy Mission. When it comes to Kilei Hakedem, number 1, Asurin Milis Roya, one is not allowed to plant And like we learned above, not only is the biblical prohibition to plant, but even if you did not do the planting, let's say the wind blew a seed of grain into my vineyard, and I am now aware of it. Now I am also biblically prohibited milakayim. I am not allowed to maintain it. And in the Gemara, we're going to start quoting the psukim, from where we learn not only the isur of loisizra karma chalkoloim, that's clear, don't plant it, but maintaining it, doiraisa, we'll see in the Gemara psuk. Furthermore, not only is there a prohibition on both, but if this prohibition was violated, and true, you have to add in detail that when it comes to the isur of milakayim, you violate it right away. But it will become asur bahano after it grows at 200. That detail the Mishnah doesn't write. What the Mishnah wants to emphasize is that the unique stringency of kalayim by a vineyard is that they become asur bahano. And here again, we'll see in the Gemara sources for this as well. Now, in contrast to kilei kalayim, to kilei akerem, let's go back to the first topic of this Masechta. When it comes to kilei ziroyim, true asurim, right? Turning chevra to daf samach zayin amud beis. And what is asur here? Also, the Gemara says both you're not allowed to plant two different species together, nor are you allowed to be mekayim, And what we're going to do, I just want to say like this, that I'm taking out a chumash. I think it's going to be helpful in a moment as well. There are two psukim that we're going to be going back and forth with. One is a pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, and one is a pasuk in Parshas Kiseitze. And we quoted the pasuk that we're quoting now in Kedoshim, which is Vayikra, Yutes. We quoted this in the beginning of this Masechta. And here, the Torah juxtaposes, the Torah puts together three prohibitions. Number one, it says, Es chukoisai tishmoiru, and what's God's choik? Behem techoloisar biakalayim. In the same verse, Sot choloisizra kalayim, and then Ubeged kalayim shatnes lo yalelach. So we have three together. And because of that, because of this hackish, number one, we're going to learn dinim one from the other. And let me go further. What am I going further? That the Torah could have written, if you see the words, instead of writing Sotcha Loisizra Kaloyim, the Torah could have written Loisizra Sotcha Kaloyim. You get it? The Torah could have written Loisizra Sotcha, don't plant in your field Kalayim. What does the Torah say? The Torah says Sotcha Loisizra Kaloyim. Why did Hashem put the word Sotcha first? So there was a limud that we're going to learn later. I'm just saying it right now. That go to the stanza before. The Torah says Behem Techoloisar Biakalayim. Come. The drush will be is that since we begin the next prohibition of planting kalayim in a field, not leisizra sotcha, but sotcha leisizra, now you can read the verse the way it's spelled out, but putting the commas in different places, and you can read kalayim sotcha loy. That's the limud. Kalayim sotcha loy, which means don't allow the existence of kalayim in your field, and that's the source. That even by kilei zirayim, not only is the isur of loisizra, but the isur is also milakayim. Okay. However, even though the prohibition by kilei zirayim is even to maintain, not only if you did violate the maintaining, but even if you actually, God forbid, violated the planting, that was the irony. You are not only allowed to have hana'ah, you can actually eat the product. That umutarim ba'achila. And since mutarim b'achila, the kolchchein be hana'ah, you for sure are allowed to have hana'ah. Now, how do you know you can have achila? So look inside, keep your finger in the Mishnah. Look inside that Asher Ilyo, in the middle of the right column, around 11 lines from the top. Divrei hamaschil umutarim b'achila. So says that Asher Ilyo ukedenafkalon bepere kolabasim in Chulin. That what the iskoish lekilei behema like we just quoted right now, that this verse in Kedoshim puts together Kilei Behema, Kilei Zeroyim, and Shatnez. So what do we learn from the juxtaposition of the Kilei Behema? Because it says, says the Gemara in Chulin, Ma Behem Techad. Just like when it comes to the crossbreeding that we'll learn in a moment, which you're not allowed to do. But if you did it, right? You have a mule. We can have benefit from a mule, guys. Just a mushroom. A mule is a crossbreed between a horse and a donkey. And now the kasha is, how do you know that if someone violated and they did crossbreed animals, how do you know you are allowed to have benefit from the crossbreed? So he quotes from the Gemara. Very simple. Because me, the Asarachmana Kalaim Ligavoya, since the Torah, as it says in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra, Shoid Oy Chesev, that in the beginning, when it says in Chumash Vayikra, Shoid Oy Chesev, Oyeski Yavalei, right? We read this on Yom Tov. So we'll have a limud that the Torah is excluding that a crossbreed is not allowed to go on the altar, even if it's a crossbreed of a goat and a lamb. Both goats and lambs are good for karbanos. Nevertheless, as a crossbreed, it's prohibited. So the Gemara says if the Torah has to exclude a crossbreed from going on the altar, what does that prove? That for a commoner, it's permitted. Because if it would be asur b'hana, then of course it's going to be excluded from being offered on the mizbeah. So just like we know that be'kilei behema is asur, but it's mutter ba'achila u'b'hana, since the Torah juxtaposes in the pasuk in Kedoshim, Yutes, Behema, and Kilei Zeroyim, that is from where we know that even if you violated the planting, it's muter bahano. And now another contrast. Again, this will be the topic of the next chapter. Kilei bigadim. Kilei bigadim is, as we will learn, it means to create a garment by mixing together the fiber of linen and wool. These two fibers only. They create shatnez. So here, you are allowed to do it. No, it's by kilei zeroyim, you're not allowed to do it. By mating two animals together, you're not allowed to mate them together. You're not allowed to do it. If you did it, then you can have benefit from the offspring. Then you can have benefit from the new plant. By kilei begadim, by shatnez, I am allowed to make a begad of shatnez. The Torah never said that I'm not allowed to make it. I'm allowed to make it. And mutarim b'chol davar. And if you made it, you can use it. In other words, the isur, you can make it, you can maintain it. What's the isur of shatnez? Ve'enam asurim elam lil boish. The Torah says explicitly, loy silbash. Loy silbash means don't wear it. Now the truth is that the pasuk that we just quoted now in Kedoshim, Yutes, writes, ubeged kilayim shatnez, loyale olecha. Loyale olecha implies something beyond wearing it. And indeed it does. Because wearing it would mean, just as an example, if I'm wearing a jacket, wearing my jacket would mean to put my hands through the sleeves. That's called wearing it. Loyale olecha means don't even drape it over yourself. That is where the Isser begins, but not before. That means there's nothing wrong with making a beged of kalayim. We don't say you're not allowed to make it. We don't say if it was made, you're not allowed to maintain it. We don't say that. So it's like the most lenient. And now let's go to the topic of this chapter. So first of all, mutarim legadol v'lekayim. You're allowed to raise them. You're allowed to maintain them. Again, you're not allowed to create them. What is the prohibition? The prohibition is only with regard to the act of mating. The act of mating, mamash means that this is what people do in the business of farming, is for someone to take the male organ of an animal and to insert it in the female. That is what's asur. I want to tell you, we'll learn in the Gemara that we learned this in the Rambam. I am allowed to put two species together in the same pen. Even though when you do that, the probability will be is that they're going to end up mating. That's not a problem. B'chlal not. No, the Isur is limited to the act of mating, that a Yid is not allowed to mate animals of two different species. But again, that's it. Once it happened and there's offspring, you can be Mekayim it, you can be Megadol it. And finally, the Gemara concludes a stringency regarding kilei behema, and that is the kilei behema sudim zem. So let's go to kilayim of animals. So let me use my example of a mule. So what happens, Chavre, if I have a mule, but mule aleph, the mother is a horse, the father is a donkey. Mule. A mule beis is the opposite. The mother is a donkey and the father is a horse. One might have thought, since mule, they both have the same yichus. So, and you're saying you can have hana. That means that we recognize there is a legitimacy now with a mule. We don't say mamzer. We don't say that. No, now that it was done, it was done. Says the Mishnah, you're right. You can have hana, you can ride the mule, you can work with the mule. But for you to mate the male and the female mule, you can only do that. Now you could mate two mules together if they have exactly the same yichus. If both of the mothers of this and that are a horse, and both of their fathers are donkeys, that's okay. But the moment you change from mother, father, father, mother, it's amazing. It's already considered a different species in the species of a mule. And now, weiter, you are usher to mate them. The Isurim continue. That is the Mishnah of the 8th chapter. And since, again, I know the chapter will focus, like I mentioned, on Kilei Behema, but we did begin speaking about Kilei Akenim. And the Mishnah began that when it comes to planting any grain or veggie in a vineyard, so we began by saying that the Isur isn't only to plant, it's also to maintain. Where do we get that from? So that will be the first question. It was everything has to be Lamudim now. It's going to be a little bit like Kachim came. So the Gemara begins, and we're quoting a Brais. It says, now this pasuk is not the pasuk that we quoted when we learned the Mishnah. This is the pasuk that we have in Kiseitze. We don't have to open it up because the Gemara, the Brais, is quoting the entire pasuk. It says, Lo Sizra Karmacha Kaloim. So says the Baraisa, okay, if the Torah says, do not sow, do not plant kalayim in your vineyard, okay, so the Torah is saying what you may not plant. So how do we know that biblically there's a prohibition that even if the wind blew the seed, or any other scenario in which you did not violate the zriya, still you are biblically not allowed to maintain it, mikayim inayim. So Talmud Loimar, guys, I know we had this just a few daf ago. There are different ways of learning it. We're going to read the words V'kerem loy kalayim, that a kerem cannot have kalayim. What? How are we going to learn pshat? We said this before. The Torah could have written loy sizra karmacha. Think about it. The word zera is in reference to grain. When the Torah says don't plant grain in your vineyard, the word kilayim is superfluous. So the reason why the Torah added the word kilayim is to tell you that you can't have kilayim in your kedem. Don't leave it there, even though you didn't plant it. Period. Okay. Now, we want to figure out, both on the Mishnah and especially on the Braisa. The Braisa already brings the source, and they both mamish equate them. Can't plant, you can't maintain. And the premise of the Gemara's inquiry will be, one thing is for sure, that if someone plants kilayim in their vineyard, they're chayiv malchus. They didn't act against a lav. Maintaining doesn't carry with it l'cha'ira malchus because you're not doing anything. And yes, there is this general rule that for a lav she'ein by malchus, she'ein by maisa, you're not going to be chayiv malchus. Rabbi Akiva holds, we'll see soon.
But if you're watering it,
what was that?
Maintaining is watering it. So
very
you are
good,
doing something.
Very good. We'll get to it in a moment. But there is maintaining of what we learned before, that I see it, and I'm happy that it's there, and I don't uproot it, and it grows on its own, and it grew to 200s. We had that before. But there is a maintaining without an act. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that holds that for some reason, that you're chayiv malchus even from a chayim. Now the fact, I know the Mishnah never mentioned the word malchus. I know that. The Braisa also never mentioned the word malchus. But it's especially from the Braisa, we learn the prohibition of mekayim mamish from the same verse where we learned the Isur of planting from Loisiz Rakan Mechakaloim. So L'cha'ira says the Gemara, are you telling me that the author of the Braisa is only Rabbi Akiva? That Rabbi Akiva is the one that holds that Hamakayim Oiver Veloisaseh. Now, we got a problem over here. First of all, what's the problem? The Marafulda says is that all of the Chachamim argue with Rabbi Akiva. And like I mentioned, it doesn't mean that the Chachamim hold that it's Midoiraisa, okay. But they hold that it's not a prohibition for which you'll be Chayiv Malkus, as you'll see. And again, the Braisa never said you're Chayiv Malkus, but the fact that we are learning both prohibitions, especially in the Braisa from the same verse, and even in the Mishnah, when the Mishnah puts everything together, why didn't the Mishnah make a contrast between one and the other? You can argue because they're both the same. Only Rabbi Akiva holds they're both the same. So says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yosi, that both the Mishnah and the Braisa don't have to follow only Das Yachid, it follows everyone. Divrei HaKoili. And indeed, that's the key, that I know that Chachamim argue with Rabbi Akiva, but don't think that they hold that it's mutter midoiraisa to be Mekayim. No, they only argue with Malkus. That Hakol Moedim Ba'asr. Ba'asr means midoiraisa. Eloma, you're not going to get Malkus because it's a laf she'ein bei Maisa. Rabbi Akiva holds Yechayev Malkus. But especially in the Mishnah never even mentioned the source. For the Mishnah to begin by saying, in contrast, that Kilei Akedem Asulam and Israel Melakayim, that's okay. That's the Kulei Alma. The problem is the Braisa. All of this has to be read into the Gemara. What's the problem with the Braisa? The Braisa doesn't only say what's prohibited. The Braisa is giving you a source. The source is a lav. And when you learn two prohibitions from the same verse, and if one of them has Malkis, so does the other. So is the Braisa only Rabbi Akiva? So the Gemara says, Mamash, what you said, Keva. Hold on a second. The Chachamim only are of the opinion that if you didn't do any action by maintaining, because it's a lav she'ein by Maisa, so therefore you're not going to get Malchus. Even the Chachamim will admit, if you water it, if you weed it, if you put more earth on it when needed, in other words, you can be mekayim something with an action, even the Chachamim will hold Yechayev Malchus. So don't tell me that since the Braisa brought a pasuk, and the pasuk is from the same verse that says you can't plant, the same verse is hinting you can't maintain. It's together. And by the way, why does Rabbi Akiva hold that even if you don't do any action, Rabbi Akiva holds Yechayev Malchus? Why? Lav she'ein bei Maisa. For this reason, because since the same verse that says Loisiz Rachakarmacha has the word Kalayim, so we learn one from the other. So in order, God put it together. Hashem could have written a separate lav, not maintaining. Hashem did not do it. It's included in the lav of don't sow. Sowing is an action. For sowing, Yechayev Malchus. So according to Rabbi Akiva, from here you learn that even Mekayim is Chayev Malchus, even if you did no action. This is great. The Chachamim disagree with that. But the Braisa can be according to the Chachamim. That's the last few lines of this Dav. So says the Gemara, no, our Braisa follows the Chachamim. And which is that B'shaloi Kiyim Al Yedei Maisa. When do the Chachamim argue with Rabbi Akiva? When do the Chachamim say, "Ooh, there's no action, you're not going to be Chayiv Malchus"? That's taka when you did mamish nothing. Why are you Chayiv? Because you are aware of it. We learned you know about it and you are content with it. You're negligent in uprooting it. Not uprooting is a non-action. But even the Chachamim will be minded that if you did an action. For example, you cover it with earth, you came and said you water it with water, then everyone will hold that you're in Leica. So therefore, both the Mishnah and the Braisa don't have to follow the Rabbi Akiva. And indeed, how do I know that even the Chachamim hold that when you do an action to maintain, the Chachamim will hold Yechayev Malchus? We found the Braisa later. That if you cover the seeds of Kalayim with earth, then yes, like not Rabbi Akiva. Everyone holds that. So therefore, we are comfortable in both the Mishnah and the Braisa following all opinions. I know that it was a small daf, but I want to stop over here because it's going to open up a whole new topic. And to be continued. The first few daf will be about psukim, lemudim, and then we're really going to dive into all of the laws of Kilei Behema.